Welcome back. This segment is on understanding ISO. And this tutorial is brought to you by Creative Online School. This segment is going to be on ISO. So what is ISO? It's one of the three pillars of the exposure triangle that we've already talked about. It's basically equivalent to what film speed was if you've ever shot film. It's how sensitive our sensor is to light, and typically ISO in cameras today range from ISO 100 to 6400 or more. Where is your ISO located? Well, if you have a view on the back of your camera, you might see it like the visual on the left. And if you have a view from the top of your camera, it might look like the visual on the right. You can locate it in your menu on some cameras. Other cameras, you might have an ISO button on top of your camera or on the back of your camera. Here's a basic guide for how to set your ISO. It says set your ISO to 100 for daylight, 200 for shade, 400 indoors, all the way up to 1600 or more for sports at night. Although it's a great guide, rather than memorizing that, you'll want to get an understanding that as you're getting into a darker situation, you're going to be raising your ISO number. Here's a visual of my dog in a room with a porch facing a window. Set at ISO 100, you just see the bridge of his nose and specular highlight in his eye. As I raise that ISO to 200, you see you get a bit more light. 400, a bit more. 800. And finally 1600, you see that he comes into even more light. So with this visual we can see just by raising our ISO number in our camera, we're getting more light as we do so. So remember in the beginning when I told you that we're going to talk about these three pillars of the exposure triangle. Every one of them lets light in, but they also have a consequence every time we let light in. So what are the consequences of raising light with ISO? Higher ISOs are going to yield more grain or noise in your image. You see these visuals here from ISO 100 to 6400, and as we're getting up into the higher ISO numbers, you're starting to see grain or noise, you may have heard it called. It's basically flex and modeling in your image and is ultimately a degradation of quality. So our goal is to always use the lowest ISO number that we possibly can for quality. Not that we're always going to be able to, but we want to stay at the lowest number that we can. If you ever shot film, you may remember that ISO 400 speed film was quite popular because it gave us light without giving us the consequence of too much grain. And be mindful that you might not see the grain on the back of your camera when you're viewing your images after taking them. You're really not going to notice it until you upload it into your computer and can see it larger, or when you go to print it. So what are some situations where you're going to have to use higher ISOs? That's going to be in churches, or in this situation at a wedding reception at the end of the evening with very low light. Indoors, where it can be dramatically darker inside than it is outside. And especially sports that are done at a dim gym, or even football. Although the football field may be well lit with lights, it's still rather dim. When we double our ISO, we're literally doubling the light. You can see here from ISO 400, we doubled the light at ISO 800. Newer cameras or professional full-frame cameras that have a larger range of apertures will handle higher ISOs better. Typically, your most important investment is with your lenses. But in the case of ISO, if you have an older camera that has a range of ISO 100 to ISO 1600, ISO 1600 is going to have a lot more grain than a newer camera that has an ISO range of 100 to 6400. As technology advances, so does the noise reduction software used. So it is definitely something to consider. To review ISO, higher ISOs get more light into our camera, and the consequence is going to be grain or noise, basically a degradation of quality.